Lion in the Wind, Chapter 15. Delgra walked into Bergen's lab and paused as he noticed that the lab was empty. "Dr. Bergen, are you here?" he shouted. Persia slipped out from behind a nearby lab table and smiled as she spotted him. "Ah, Major, what brings you here?" she asked cheerfully. "I'm looking for your father. Is he around?" Persia shook her head. "He's out in the back doing I'm right here," came a voice from the far side of the lab. Both of them then turned to see Dr. Bergen stepping through a nearby doorway, followed by two of the new lions. "Sorry, I was outside doing some tests on these two bodies. I had to make sure they were ready before I loaded their artificial sentience." "Understood. Do you have a few minutes that we can talk?" asked Delgra. "Sure," said Bergen. Delgra looked at Persia briefly, and then back at Bergen. "In private, please." Bergen looked at Delgra in curiosity, and then down at Persia. "Would you please take these two over to the programming station and hook them up? I'd like to begin loading their artificial sentience framework as soon as possible." Persia nodded. "I'll get right on it," she replied. "Thanks." "Lions, please transfer voice command authorization to Persia," said Bergen. The two droids chirped, and then responded in unison, "Acknowledged. Voice command authorization has been successfully transferred." "All right, follow me," said Persia as she turned and began walking across the lab. The two droids immediately turned and followed her obediently. Bergen briefly watched them go before turning to Delgra. "Will my office be good enough?" he asked. Delgra nodded. "It'll do." The two men quickly stepped into Bergen's office, and closed the door behind them. Bergen then reached over and poured himself a fresh cup of katter, and sat down on a nearby stool as Delgra sat down in a chair near the door. "So, what did you want to talk to me about?" asked Bergen. "I'm trying to find an explanation for Tegani's strange actions from a couple weeks ago. I conveniently left it out of my report that he would not kill Mestro when ordered. But I know that at some point in time someone higher up is going to find out. So I want to have some answers for them in case they ever do." Bergen took a sip of his katter and then gave Delgra a curious glance. "So what are you looking for specifically?" he asked. "I want to know why he refused to kill Mestra, despite being given a direct order to do so." Bergen sighed and thought about this for a moment. Tegani was confused. "Confused? Explain," said Delgra curiously. "Well, as you already know, Tegani has a good heart. But he also still has much to learn about many of the things we take for granted. Such as? Well, everything he knows about good and evil, right and wrong, friend and foe, and other things like that, is very black and white to him. He hasn't learned yet how to identify and discern the subtle shades of gray that we understand, and deal with every day. To him, all Yigzin are good, and all Gorg are bad, regardless if that is true or not. Take Mestra for example. He looked just like any other Yigzin officer that Tegani had ever encountered before and, as such, Tegani automatically assumed that he was good, and thus would not touch him. He also wasn't here when Mestra revealed himself as a traitor. So he was lacking that bit of information when he made his decision not to attack. I've tried to explain it to him, and I think he understands, but only time will tell if he truly does." Delgra frowned. "That's going to be a problem if he ever has to deal with another Midizin infiltrator like Mestra again. Was he ever taught about the Midizin?" Bergen nodded slightly. "He knows the technical side of who they are, but not any of the political subtleties that go with it. That's not something you can just teach someone through simple book learning, which is where most of his current knowledge and understanding comes from." Delgra rolled his eyes. "Wonderful, and I bet it doesn't help things any that the Midizin are our sister race." Bergen shook his head. "It likely doesn't because, even though the Midizin are genetically removed from us by nearly 1,200 years, they're still Yigzin at their roots." "Yes, I know that. But, even so, you can't deny that there are clear differences between us and them, enough that he should be able to easily differentiate between our two races." Bergen nodded. "Yes, he does have the ability to identify them in ways that we cannot. Their body odor is one of the biggest. The problem is, many of them look and sound exactly like us down to the finest degree. So that's a bit confusing to him. Is there any way he can better differentiate between the two races aside from body odor? I only ask because I want him able to detect traitors and spies without having to rely entirely on a person's biology. Yes, there is. But even then it's not a perfect science. So I told him to also include other factors into his determinations, such as a person's body language and how they behave. Delgra drummed his fingers on his knee. That's good, but it still leads us back to the problem of his disobeying a direct order. I don't have to remind you, Doctor, that we're in the middle of a war. So obediently following orders is a necessity if we are to survive this. I understand that, Major, but it wasn't that he didn't want to obey the order. It's that he couldn't, said Bergen. Delgra looked at him in confusion. What do you mean? He asked. Bergen screwed up his face slightly as he pondered how best to answer this. As you already know, Tegani sees all Yigzin as members of his family. I do. But why does he? Asked Delgra. That's mostly because of how he views Persia and myself. In his mind, if we are his parents, then, by extension, all Yigzin are his family as well. An extended family, but still family. That's why he is unwilling to harm any Yigzin he encounters anywhere, for any reason whatsoever because, to him, that would be the same thing as harming either myself or Persia. Delgra pondered this for several moments before shaking his head. That still doesn't make sense. Bergen laughed. You're asking me to explain to you how a machine thinks when I'm not entirely sure of that myself. Honestly, it's rather impressive that I'm even able to understand what I already do. So how deep does his loyalty to family go? Asked Delgra. Of that, I can't be certain. At least, not yet. So what if, for example, I attacked you? How would he respond to that? Asked Delgra. Bergen shrugged. I really don't know. I've explored the subject with him, but he doesn't seem willing to answer that question. Given his lack of action against Mestra, he'd likely treat us all the same, even though he gives the greater respect to Persia and myself. Delgra sighed. So, in other words, he's incapable of attacking a Yigzin, even if he was ordered to do so, or your lives were threatened by another Yigzin like myself. Bergen nodded. At this time? Yes, I believe so. Delgra frowned at this. So then his failure to follow orders the other day was more an incidental effect of how he views our people, rather than an act of actual, willful disobedience? Bergen shrugged. For the most part, yes. However, his view of the Yigzin is considerably more complex than that, such that it can't easily be put into a box. Delgra groaned. I was hoping for another, simpler answer. But I guess there isn't one, is there? Bergen sighed. I don't know how much simpler I can make it. As much as we'd like to have Tegani be a simple creature that's simple to understand, the truth is, he's not. His mind is extremely complex, even by my standards. Delgra frowned. That's both good and troublesome at the same time. Unfortunately, it is, replied Bergen. Delgra stood up, straightened his uniform, and said, Thank you for your time, Doctor. While I'm disappointed that this incident happened, I'm pleased that you were able to provide at least some explanation for his actions, even if it was somewhat insufficient. I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help, replied Bergen. Given the circumstances, at least I'm able to come away with some answers, even if they're not quite what I was hoping for. I apologize. I'll see what I can do to better understand how Tegani thinks about things like this, and hopefully get you some better answers eventually. Delgra nodded. I appreciate that, Doctor. It will be a great help to us once he is finally able to correctly deal with similar situations like this in the future, should that ever happen again. Bergen frowned. I will do my best to help him with that. But, that being said, I also pray that we never have to deal with something like that ever again. Agreed. Tegani strode up to Welk and gently tapped him on the leg to get his attention. Welk turned around in surprise and then smiled. Oh, good afternoon, Tegani. What are you up to? He asked. Captain Silvers wants you. He asked that I bring you to his office as soon as possible. Welk shrugged. All right, lead on. The two then walked together to the administration building and found the secretary waiting for them at the door. Seeing them, she reached over and pressed the intercom button. Sir, Sergeant Welk and Tegani are here to see you, she said. Thank you, Ms. Eva. Send them in, replied Silvers. Yes, sir, she replied. She then escorted Welk and Tegani down the hallway to where Silvers had his office. The secretary then knocked on the door and said, Sir, they're here. Send them in, came the reply. The secretary then opened the door and gestured for them to enter. Welk and Tegani quickly stepped into the office, paused, and then introduced themselves. Silvers looked at them briefly, before motioning to a chair in front of his desk. Please, sit down, he said. Yes, sir, said Welk. Welk and Tegani quickly took their places in front of the desk. I have good news for you, gentlemen. We've just recently received approval to expand the Robotic Lion program. As a result, we'll be promoting you to Sergeant First Class and moving you to the position of Platoon Sergeant. Thank you, sir, but I don't have a platoon. Our unit only has one squad, said Welk. Well, you do now. Your present unit is being expanded to a total of 6 squads, each of which will be assigned their own lion. I expect you to get them up to speed as quickly as possible. I will, sir, but where are we getting the 5 other lions from? Silvers raised an eyebrow in intrigued surprise. Weren't you told about the new lions that Dr. Bergen has been building? Asked Silvers. Welk shook his head. That's news to me, sir. It must have been on a need-to-know basis, because I certainly wasn't told anything about this. Well, then we'll need to rectify that. I'll make sure you get all of the appropriate briefing papers by the end of the day. Thank you, sir. So how soon can we expect the new lions? Soon. I don't know exactly when, but it shouldn't be too long. The lions are currently in the final stages of programming right now. Tegani, given that these lions won't have the luxury of training in the same way that you did, I'll need you to handle their initial education, and prepare them in the best way you know how, as quickly as possible. Tegani nodded. I will do my best, he replied. Just then the intercom chirped. Silvers reached over and pressed the talk button. Yes, what is it? He asked. Sir, the front gate is reporting that the new arrivals are here. Good, is there a lieutenant with them? Yes, sir. Excellent. Have him report to me as soon as possible. Tell the others to go to the barracks for now and get settled in, he replied. Yes, sir. Silvers looked back at Welk and said, Well, looks like you'll get to meet your new men sooner than I expected. I'm looking forward to it, sir, said Welk. Silvers then continued to brief Welk on what his new unit would be expected to do, how it would function now that there were 6 lions, and how their role on the battlefront would play out going forward. Finally, after several minutes, the voice of the secretary came across the intercom again. Sir, Lieutenant Pentel is here to see you as requested. Tegani and Welk looked at each other in surprise. It couldn't be, said Welk. There's a 270,000 to 1 probability that it could, said Tegani. Send him in, said Silvers. Yes, sir, replied the secretary. Welk and Tegani then turned towards the door and listened as footsteps approached. Soon there was a knock at the door. Permission to enter, came a voice. Tegani perked up at the sound. Permission granted, replied Silvers. The door then swung open, and Pentel entered, saluted, and said, First Lieutenant Pentel reporting as requested, sir. Is that actually you? Asked Welk in surprise. Pentel turned and looked curiously at Welk, and then perked up happily. Sergeant Welk? By Mashua's name, it is you, he exclaimed. Silvers raised an eyebrow in interest. Do you two know each other? He asked. Yes, sir. We served together briefly during the first day of combat. Sergeant Welk is an amazing NCO, sir, said Pentel happily. He walked up and patted Tegani on the head. And this guy right here saved our lives when our assault went sour. He's quite the fighter, and we owe our lives to him. Silvers found this intriguing. Interesting. Well, since you three apparently know each other already, I guess you can get straight to business putting your new unit together. Pentel looked at Silvers in surprise. Come again, sir? He's your new platoon sergeant, lieutenant, replied Silvers. Pentel looked at Welk, who grinned widely. Glad to be serving with you again, sir, said Welk. Pentel chuckled. I have a feeling this is going to be quite an interesting assignment. Delgro walked into Bergen's laboratory and up to the frustrated scientist as he sat at his programming terminal. What's the progress on the new lions, doctor? He asked. Bergen sighed and rubbed his face. Decent, considering the circumstances. Is something the matter? Asked Delgro curiously. No, not really. I just ran into a few complications I wasn't expecting. How soon do you think you can have them ready? Bergen sighed. I'll know as soon as I can figure out why they're not taking their new programming. Once I solve that, you'll have your lions. Delgro looked at him in concern. Is this going to be a problem? He asked. Bergen waved dismissively. Nah, not really. I ran into the same issue with Tegani. I eventually sorted it out with him, so I should be able to do the same with them. All right, but please hurry, said Delgro. Bergen nodded. I'll do my best. Delgro then turned and left. As he did, Tegani watched this curiously from a corner of the room and pondered all that he'd heard. Meshwa, can you hear me? He thought. I am here, came a voice in his mind. I've been thinking. You were the one who gave me life after my father built me. Yet you have not done the same for my new siblings. Why is that? It is not their time. But soon, smiled the voice. Tegani pondered this. Then, if it is soon, when will that be? However, there was no answer. Can I tell my father about this? He is deeply worried, and extremely frustrated. It is not the time for such things to be revealed to him. For now the truth must remain hidden. But, when the time is right, it will be revealed to him, came the voice. Why must it be hidden? There is something he must learn first if he is to become what he needs to be. What is it that he must learn? I will teach it to him if you will let me. Meshwa laughed. This is not a lesson that can be taught with mere words. Only failure will teach him what he must learn and understand. Tegani pondered this idea, but pursued it no further. He then sat in silence for several minutes longer, watching his dad struggle fruitlessly to get his fellow lions working. After a bit, he turned his attention to the new lions and pondered their future. How soon will my new siblings awaken? He thought after several minutes. Soon, came the reply. How soon? Silence. Tegani considered asking the question again, but thought better of it. If his past experiences with Meshwa had taught him anything, it was that Meshwa never revealed more than was needed at any given moment. So no amount of probing and prodding would gain him anything he wasn't supposed to know yet. After several minutes the voice called out to him again. Yes, thought Tegani in reply. Go to your mother. She needs your companionship right now. Her heart is broken, and your words will be the salve that will heal that wound. Tegani pondered this curiously. Was Meshwa speaking figuratively, literally, or allegorically? He then turned and studied Persia as she sat in a far corner of the laboratory. She seemed distant and detached, as though her body were there, but her mind wasn't. Seeing this, he knew that Meshwa's words weren't to be taken literally as she wasn't physically wounded in any way that he could see. So he decided that the statement was meant to be taken figuratively. He soon stood up, walked over, and sat down in front of her. What's bothering you, mother? He asked. Persia sighed, but didn't look up. I'm afraid for you and the others that, if you go out again, you won't come back, and I don't want to lose you, she said with both fear and sadness in her voice. Tegani furrowed a brow at this. Meshwa has promised that I will not die until my purpose here has been fulfilled, he replied. Persia slowly raised her head to look at him as tears poured from her eyes. Tegani studied this with curiosity and intrigue. I still do not fully understand emotions as of yet. But, I do know that, if you keep crying like you are, you'll expel so much water that you will dry up and blow away, he said. Persia nodded at this, and then blinked. A moment later she began to snicker and soon broke out into a roaring guffaw. Tegani raised an eyebrow in curiosity at this. Was something I said funny? He asked curiously. Persia took a deep breath, and then smiled widely. I don't know. I just started laughing, she said with a chuckle. The salve that heals a wounded heart, thought Tegani. This intrigued him. He hadn't intended to make a joke. He'd merely stated his thoughts on her current state in hopes of making her stop crying, thereby saving her from suffering any form of sorrow-induced dehydration. Creating humor had not been his intention. And yet, somehow he had done exactly that which, in turn, had helped relieve a portion of the anxiety that Persia had been feeling. This now made him wonder if other similar actions, such as those he had previously seen shared between his parents, as well as others, might help her further. Deciding to give it a try, he leaned over and wrapped his arms around Persia in a gentle, consoling embrace. I love you, Mom, he then said. At first Persia was surprised by this. But eventually she hugged him in return, and then began crying tears of joy as a great big smile broke out across her face. I love you too, son,